My name is Fatima Al-Rashid, and I'm writing this from my apartment in Detroit the day after my naturalization ceremony, where I finally became a United States citizen after 12 years, $47,000 in legal fees and application costs, hundreds of hours waiting in USCIS offices for appointments, countless invasive background checks treating me as potential terrorist threat despite being a refugee who fled terrorism, and a citizenship test requiring me to know American history and government better than most native-born citizens, while being treated throughout the entire process as a perpetual foreigner whose belonging in America was conditional on satisfying bureaucratic requirements and surviving a system seemingly designed to break people's spirits through humiliation, power imbalances, arbitrary delays, and the constant reminder that citizenship was a privilege to be earned through degradation rather than a right to be respected. At 38, I should feel triumphant about achieving citizenship, but instead I feel traumatized, exhausted, and angry about the psychological warfare I endured to gain belonging in the country I had already called home for over a decade. The immigration journey began when I arrived in the United States at age 26 as an Iraqi refugee fleeing sectarian violence that had killed family members and made remaining in Baghdad impossible for educated women who worked outside the home like myself. I had been a university lecturer in English literature before the violence escalated, and I arrived in America with hopes that my education, English fluency, and determination would allow me to rebuild my life and eventually become an American citizen who could participate fully in my adopted country's civic life. The refugee resettlement reality was immediately disillusioning as I discovered that my Iraqi university credentials weren't recognized in the United States, that the Refugee Assistance Program provided minimal support for only a few months, and that I would need to start over economically despite my education and professional experience. I worked multiple low-wage jobs, retail, food service, cleaning, while trying to navigate complex immigration processes, learn American cultural norms, and overcome trauma from the violence I had fled in Iraq. The green card application began 2 years after my arrival when I qualified to adjust status from refugee to lawful permanent resident, a process requiring extensive documentation, background checks, biometric appointments, and a USCIS interview where an officer would determine whether I deserved to remain in America permanently. The application fee was $1,225, a devastating expense when I was earning minimum wage and sending money to support family members who remained in Iraq, but required if I wanted to establish permanent legal status. The fingerprint appointment scheduling was the first indication of the power imbalance and disregard for applicants that would characterize my entire immigration experience. USCIS scheduled my biometric appointment during my work shift with 2 weeks' notice, providing no options to reschedule and no concern for whether the mandatory appointment would conflict with employment obligations. I had to choose between attending the appointment and potentially losing my job for missing work, ultimately attending the appointment and being fired from my retail position for unexplained absence. The background check delays extended for 18 months beyond the normal processing time as my Iraqi origin triggered administrative processing, involving multiple security screenings, FBI name checks, and interagency reviews treating me as potential security threat despite my refugee status indicating I had already undergone extensive vetting before being admitted to the United States. The indefinite delay meant living in legal limbo, unable to travel internationally, unable to accept certain job opportunities requiring permanent residency, and constantly anxious about whether my application would eventually be approved or whether some unknown issue in my background would result in denial. The USCIS interview for my green card application was one of the most dehumanizing experiences of my life, as the immigration officer asked intrusive questions about my religious beliefs, my opinions about American foreign policy in Iraq, whether I had ever been a member of terrorist organizations, and whether I supported violence against the United States. Questions that treated me as suspected enemy rather than refugee, fleeing the same terrorism that America claimed to oppose. The officer's aggressive tone and suspicious attitude made clear that my Iraqi origin made me inherently untrustworthy regardless of my refugee status or years of compliant residence in America. The conditional approval came with requirements for continued monitoring and restrictions on my activities, including prohibitions on international travel without advance permission, requirements to report address changes within 10 days, and ongoing background checks that could result in my permanent residency being revoked if any issues arose. The permanent resident status felt anything but permanent, instead creating ongoing surveillance and vulnerability to deportation based on bureaucratic decisions I had no power to challenge. The citizenship eligibility waiting period required maintaining continuous residence and physical presence in the United States for 5 years after receiving my green card, meaning I couldn't visit family in Iraq for extended periods without jeopardizing my citizenship timeline. The inability to return home for family emergencies, weddings, funerals, or other important events created painful separation from loved ones and resentment about how immigration law forced me to choose between pursuing citizenship and maintaining family connections. The citizenship application filing 5 years after receiving my green card required another $725 in government fees, plus thousands of dollars in attorney fees because the application process was complex and mistakes could result in denial and potential deportation proceedings. My immigration attorney charged $3,500 for preparing the N-400 application for naturalization, a form that was theoretically simple enough to complete without legal assistance but realistically required expert help because any errors or omissions could be interpreted as fraud or material misrepresentation. The citizenship test preparation consumed hundreds of hours as I studied the 100 civics questions that USCIS might ask during my naturalization interview, memorizing facts about American history, government structure, and civic responsibilities that most native-born citizens didn't know. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was required to demonstrate knowledge about American democracy that far exceeded what was expected of people born with citizenship, as if immigrants needed to prove they deserve belonging through superior civic literacy rather than being accepted as equal members of American society. The English test requirement added another layer of anxiety despite my fluency, because USCIS officers had absolute discretion to determine whether applicants' English proficiency was adequate, and I had heard stories of applicants being failed for minor pronunciation issues or accent-related comprehension difficulties. The subjective nature of the English assessment created fear that my Iraqi accent might be interpreted as insufficient English ability despite my graduate education in English literature and decades of using English professionally and personally. The biometric appointment repeat happened 3 times throughout my 12-year immigration journey, as USCIS required new fingerprints for background checks at each stage of the process, scheduling appointments during work hours with no flexibility, charging additional fees each time, and treating each appointment as if I were a suspected criminal being processed through law enforcement databases rather than an applicant for citizenship voluntarily submitting to screening. The citizenship interview scheduled notification provided only 3 weeks' notice for an appointment that would determine my entire future, requiring me to take time off work, arrange childcare for my American-born son, travel to the USCIS office, and wait for hours in a crowded waiting room before being called for my 15-minute interview that could result in approval or denial based on the officer's subjective assessment of my testimony and documentation. The interview terror was overwhelming as I sat in the USCIS waiting room surrounded by other anxious applicants, all of us adults who had lived in America for years but were about to be tested like school children on our knowledge of American civics and our worthiness to belong. The power imbalance was stark. The officer who would interview me had absolute authority to approve or deny my application, to ask any questions they deemed relevant, to determine whether my answers were satisfactory, and to make life-changing decisions about my future with minimal oversight or accountability. The interrogation experience felt more like criminal investigation than citizenship interview, as the USCIS officer questioned me suspiciously about gaps in my employment history, asked why I had traveled to Jordan to visit displaced Iraqi family members, and demanded explanations for routine financial transactions that appeared in my background check. The officer's tone implied that I was potentially lying or hiding something rather than treating me as applicant in good faith seeking citizenship in the country where I had lived law-abidingly for over a decade. The civics test questions included asking me to name the current vice president, explain the Bill of Rights, identify the number of amendments to the Constitution, describe the system of checks and balances, and recite various facts about American government and history. I answered all 10 questions correctly, having studied extensively, but the experience of being tested on knowledge that most native-born citizens lacked felt like hazing ritual designed to remind immigrants that our belonging was conditional and that we had to prove ourselves worthy through superior civic knowledge. The approval notification came 3 months after my interview when I received a letter saying my application had been approved, and I was scheduled for the naturalization ceremony where I would take the oath of citizenship. The relief was overwhelming but also accompanied by resentment about the 12 years of stress, the nearly $50,000 in costs, the invasive questioning, the power imbalances, and the constant treatment as suspicious outsider that had characterized my entire immigration journey. The naturalization ceremony happened in a convention center with over 100 other people from dozens of countries, all of us taking the oath of allegiance together while USCIS officials processed us through the ceremony efficiently but impersonally, treating us as bureaucratic tasks to be completed rather than individuals achieving a profound milestone. The ceremony included patriotic videos, speeches about American values, and the oath itself, but the experience felt more like graduation from a degrading ordeal than celebration of joining American civic community. The citizenship certificate that I received at the ceremony represented legal status rather than social belonging, official recognition that I was now American, but not acknowledgement of the trauma I had endured to achieve that status or addressing the ways I would continue to be treated as foreign despite my citizenship. The certificate didn't erase my accent, didn't change my name, didn't eliminate others' perceptions of me as immigrant rather than American, and didn't compensate for 12 years of vulnerability, scrutiny, and humiliation. The post-citizenship depression was unexpected but profound as I realized that becoming a citizen hadn't actually changed my day-to-day experiences of otherness, didn't protect me from discrimination or xenophobia, didn't erase the trauma of the immigration process, and didn't provide the belonging and acceptance I had imagined citizenship would bring. I was legally American, but still socially positioned as perpetual foreigner whose true belonging would always be questioned. The therapy that helped me process the accumulated immigration trauma was with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist who specialized in working with refugees and immigrants and understood that the immigration process itself created PTSD-like symptoms through chronic stress, power imbalances, invasive questioning, indefinite waiting, and constant vulnerability to life-changing bureaucratic decisions. She validated that my experience wasn't unusual and that many immigrants experienced similar trauma from navigating systems designed to break people's spirits. The U.S. immigration system is fundamentally about power and control, treating immigrants as supplicants begging for the privilege of belonging rather than as human beings with inherent dignity who deserve fair processes, Dr. Mitchell explained during one of our sessions. The financial costs, the invasive scrutiny, the arbitrary delays, the degrading interviews, and the citizenship test requiring superior civic knowledge all serve to remind immigrants that belonging is conditional, that they must earn acceptance through suffering and proving themselves worthy, and that even after achieving citizenship, they'll remain different from native-born Americans who never had to earn their status through ordeal. She helped me understand that the anger, exhaustion, and disappointment I felt about my citizenship experience were appropriate responses to systemic mistreatment, and that healing required acknowledging the trauma rather than dismissing it as necessary sacrifice for achieving American dream. The process of becoming American had fundamentally shaped my relationship with America in ways that made full belonging and trust difficult, even after achieving citizenship. The advocacy work that emerged from my experience includes connecting with immigrant rights organizations to push for immigration process reforms that would reduce costs, provide more humane timelines and processes, eliminate unnecessary invasive questioning, and treat applicants with dignity rather than suspicion. I share my story to make visible the hidden costs of immigration that go far beyond application fees to include psychological trauma, economic exploitation, and degradation that the system inflicts on people desperately trying to belong. The policy advocacy includes working on legislation to reduce naturalization fees that create barriers for low-income immigrants, eliminate citizenship test requirements that hold immigrants to higher civic knowledge standards than native-born citizens, provide clear timelines for application processing rather than indefinite delays, and create accountability mechanisms for USCIS officers who abuse their power through unnecessarily invasive questioning or discriminatory treatment. The community support work involves creating peer support groups for people navigating the immigration process, where we can share experiences, provide emotional support, and reduce the isolation that comes from going through traumatic bureaucratic ordeals that native-born Americans can't understand or relate to. The community validates that our experiences are real and that the trauma we carry from immigration processes deserves recognition and healing. The financial advocacy includes pushing for sliding scale application fees based on income, free or low-cost legal services for immigration applicants who can't afford private attorneys, and regulations preventing attorneys from exploiting vulnerable immigrants through excessive fees for routine services. The financial barriers to immigration and citizenship create class-based exclusions that violate principles of equal access to legal status. The cultural education work involves helping Americans understand that citizenship ceremonies represent survival of degrading ordeals rather than uncomplicated celebrations, that naturalized citizens carry trauma from immigration processes that affect our relationship with America, and that asking "Where are you from?" or treating citizenship as something immigrants should be grateful for ignores the costs we paid and the ongoing othering we experience despite legal status. The intergenerational impact concerns me as I watch my American-born son grow up with citizenship he never had to earn, experiencing belonging I can never fully access despite my certificate, and I worry about how to help him understand the privilege he has that I lacked and the trauma his mother carries from the process of becoming American that he'll never experience. Today, I work as an immigration advocate and peer counselor while also teaching ESL to new immigrants and refugees, using my experience to help others navigate the traumatic system while also fighting for reforms that might make the process less degrading for future generations. The citizenship I achieved feels like surviving rather than succeeding, but I'm determined to transform that survival into advocacy for systemic change. The citizenship reflection 3 years after my naturalization ceremony includes acknowledging that becoming American cost me 12 years of anxiety, $47,000 I could have used to build economic security, countless hours of stress and humiliation, and psychological trauma that I'm still processing through therapy. I'm American now, but the question remains whether America will ever truly accept me as belonging here, or whether I'll always be conditional American whose citizenship feels more like permission slip than full membership. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with providers experienced in refugee and immigrant trauma helps process the psychological impacts of immigration processes and chronic stress from power imbalances and vulnerability. Immigration legal services, including nonprofit organizations providing free or low-cost assistance, reduce financial barriers and exploitation by predatory attorneys. Peer support groups for immigrants navigating the system provide emotional validation and reduce isolation from experiences that native-born Americans cannot understand. Policy advocacy organizations working on immigration reform push for more humane processes, reduced costs, and accountability for USCIS officials who abuse power. Community education helps native-born Americans understand hidden costs of immigration, including trauma, financial exploitation, and degradation beyond what citizenship ceremonies suggest. Mental health services specifically addressing immigration-related PTSD provide treatment for trauma from invasive scrutiny, power imbalances, and chronic vulnerability. Financial assistance programs help low-income immigrants access legal services and afford application fees that create barriers to legal status. Advocacy for clear processing timelines and accountability mechanisms addresses arbitrary delays and power imbalances that characterize current system. Today, when native-born Americans celebrate naturalization ceremonies as heartwarming examples of American dream, I remind them that those ceremonies represent survival of degrading ordeals, that becoming American cost me more than they can imagine, and that my citizenship came with trauma that I'll carry forever. The American dream isn't free. Immigrants pay for it with money, time, dignity, and psychological well-being in a system designed to remind us that our belonging is conditional and our acceptance depends on satisfying bureaucrats who wield absolute power over our futures.